In today's video, I'm going to take you through my recent trip to Las Vegas where I worked as a mechanic for the T100 Lake Las Vegas Triathlon. The event included a professional and age group race, and my role was to help with the age group bike tune-ups leading into the Sunday race. It was me and two other mechanics, and we had around 200 bike tune-ups plus bike builds and some larger mechanical problems to get through. So let me take you behind the scenes of this event and show you what goes into making sure 200 plus bikes are ready to race. The race was being hosted at the Westin Lake Las Vegas, and my job started on Friday morning. The first order of business was to unload bikes from the airport shuttle and transfer them to the Athlete Expo. There are two styles of bike boxes, hard cases and soft cases, and we saw a good mix of both styles. The loaded cases weigh around 50 pounds each, and you do have to be careful with unloading them to avoid damage to the bike. All of the bikes in these boxes were scheduled for tune-ups. Most athletes were responsible for building their own bike first out of the box, and then we'd inspect and check their already built bike. But we had maybe 15 or so athletes where we had to build and tune their bike as well, which added quite a bit of time to the process. The pace started out pretty slow, and the three of us started working on the bikes fairly quickly. We all had our own bike stands and tools, but it was a good team atmosphere and we worked well as a group. This made the busy day a lot more enjoyable and helped when one of us needed to borrow a tool or needed some extra help. As athletes assembled their bikes through the morning, we started getting a steady stream of bikes delivered that needed to be tuned. If you work on many tri bikes, you're going to see that a lot of them tend to have rusty bolts in the stem due to sweat and drink mix that gets spilled in that area. So a little trick that I use when I'm tightening bolts is to insert my hex key into the stem and then wiggle it like this to make sure that it's fully engaged in the bolt when I turn it. When athletes dropped off their bike, I was also chatting with them and taking notes on anything in particular I needed to fix on their bike. This bike here flew in from Germany, and after travel, the gears weren't really shifting anymore. Most of these bikes were electronic gears, and in this case, the wires were not fully connected to the junction box. The solution was to remove the wires, remove the worn out seals, and reinstall the wires, which got the gears working again. My usual work style is actually to go a little bit slower over all the bikes and address all the problems before returning them. But with 200 bikes to go through and only so much time, I had to accept many solutions where I had to stop working on the bike and just move on to the next one. We just aimed to have it working well for race day, and then we let the athletes know if there's anything further going on with their bike that they should address when they get home. Once we were done with the bike tune-ups, we hung the completed bikes on this rack, and then we went next door to get another new bike to work on from this room. The flow was more or less continuous, and the bikes really started to pile up in the mid-afternoon. This was my first event working like this, and both the other mechanics were great at helping me understand how the flow should go, and how to ration my time as well. It's definitely easy to go down the rabbit hole trying to fix some small issue, but often these can bog down the flow and create a strain on the whole system. Typically a bike could be looked over in 15 to 20 minutes, but some bikes came to the event with bigger issues. This particular bike is a great example of that. It was set up as tubeless, and during travel the tire had come unseated from the rim, and all the sealant was leaking onto the wheel. The way to fix this is to reseat the tire, which involves using an air compressor. The burst of air causes the tire to rapidly fill and snap into place on the edge of the rim. Fortunately, we were able to borrow a compressor to do this with and successfully get the tire back on. Bingo. Problems like this came up somewhat regularly through the day, with some bikes taking an extra 30 to 60 minutes to solve their issues. Almost all the bikes we saw were electronic gears, hydraulic brakes, and many had tubeless setups as well. These systems can be great when they're working well, but when they have an issue, that can take a lot of extra time to diagnose and fix. And the expertise to do so is well above what most age group athletes are comfortable with, meaning we had a lot of worried athletes coming to us with problems like this through the day. You may have also noticed that my bike stand looks a little different, and that's because I'm using the Silca Hero Bell adapter inside the clamp. Many tri bikes have an aero seat post that doesn't fit well inside clamping bike stands, and it's also not a great idea to clamp on carbon frames. The solution the Silca product offers is that you can just rest the bike in the top tube and use rubber straps to hold it in place. During my checks of the bike, I'm often checking for loose bolts and loose parts. This involves wiggling and trying to move different components, and on this bike I found that both sides and the aero bar pads were moving side to side. The solution was pretty simple. The pads are attached by Velcro, which covers the bolts, so I could just pull them off and tighten up the cups. We continued working through the bikes during the afternoon, but even though we were still working well, the pile of bikes to complete it still was adding up. This is where it was nice that there was three mechanics going at it. If one of us was stuck on a bike with bigger problems, the others could keep the flow going and get through the other bikes. The day started to feel like a long bike ride, where your legs are just moving and you're going into automatic mode, going through the motions. The quality of work was still high, but day one finished off around 6 p.m. for around a 10-hour day of constant bike repairs. Okay, so that was day one. Busy day. I'm super tired now. That was probably the busiest day working on bikes that I've ever had to do, but super fun, and gonna go eat some dinner, have a good sleep, and we're gonna do it all again tomorrow. After a good sleep, we started back on Saturday right at 8 a.m. with more repairs. We had a line of around 20 people waiting for us right at the opening, and it was busy from the start. Because we were fresh, we got off to a good start and began going through the bikes quickly. During one of the routine checks, I was just inflating the bike's tire when it suddenly burst. It was due to a tube failure where the bond around the valve stem fails, and I was happy this happened to the athlete in the pre-race check and not in the actual race. Following this, I had a good string of bikes without any serious problems. Although there's lots of different brands and styles, it's actually a lot of the same sort of thing. The principles in braking and shifting are all the same between brands, and most of the components tend to attach to the frame in the same way, with similar tools being required. But of course, this is bikes, and some manufacturers make things overly complicated for no reason. Enter this next bike, a BMC that was having shifting issues. This is a great example of over-engineering, and something that's a huge headache for mechanics. It was a series of wires and pulleys for the braking system, which after some research is for increasing pad clearance while maintaining lever feel. But luckily I was just on the hunt for the junction box, which turned out to be hidden under the stem, and loosening this small screw gave me access. And that's a really big predicament with the bike industry. Bikes have become more and more complicated with proprietary parts, and repairs are more lengthy and expensive as a result. So for example, on a modern bike with all the cables hidden inside the frame, the cables run through the headset bearing. The upside is a clean, streamlined bike with no visible cables, but the downside is in order to replace the headset bearings, which is usually like a 15 to 20 minute job, now you have to fully remove all of the cables from the bike, cut the hydraulic lines, fish out the hoses from the handlebars, replace the bearings, then reinstall the brake lines, which may have to be fully replaced, and then rebleed the brakes to finish off the process. And other things like different bottom bracket standards, tubeless setup, or brand-specific parts all make working on bikes an additional challenge. Another common issue we saw at the event was with hydraulic brakes, where the lever got depressed during travel, and the pads stuck together since the wheel was off the bike. The solution was to slide a thin metal tool in between the pads and push the pistons back into the caliper. There's a number of tools that can work for this, and here I'm just using a thin cone wrench to gently push the pistons back. If you're traveling with your bike and you remove the wheels, you'll want to make sure that you put a pad spacer inside your brake calipers to prevent this issue. Also, make sure you're careful with your disc brake rotors so they don't pick up a bend and start rubbing. Here's a couple other different things that came through today. There was a race day chain an athlete had us install for them, which was coated in a mix of wax and Teflon, and when we pedaled it through the gears, it was flinging up tons of white Teflon dust all over the gears and wheel. I prefer just to hot wax the chain and keep this kind of mess down. Another athlete had gone for a test ride, and after he assembled his bike, he was complaining of a noise while putting out power. Turned out he hadn't fully installed the pedals, and tightening them down solved the problem. This bike here lost its proprietary headset expander bolt during travel, and this bike here had a severely bent derailleur hanger that we had to carefully bend back into position. The work ended a bit earlier today, and we had a chance to go outside and watch some of the men's professional race. Ended up hiking up this hill beside the transition area and got a great view of the lake and surrounding area. It also gave some good views of the athletes riding by on part of the bike course. I heard from many athletes after the event that this was one of the toughest courses they've done, with lots of up and down and rolling hills. This event was unique in that age group and pros were all staying in the same hotel, and it was a pretty spectator-friendly event. Most longer course racing can be pretty boring to watch, with spectators only catching small glimpses of the athletes, but here, with the screens and multiple loop course, this event was much more exciting to watch. After the age group race on Sunday, there was around 10 to 15 bikes that needed to be packed up. Athletes dropped their bikes and travel cases, and we carefully disassembled and packed their bikes. It was a quiet day, but the fatigue from the previous days made the work feel tougher than it was. Monday morning started early at 4 a.m., and it was a day where we loaded the bikes back onto the airport shuttle and then drove them to the airport. I only captured a bit of footage from today, but we ended up doing around 6 trips back and forth before I flew home myself late on Monday night. It was a whirlwind of a weekend, but definitely a fun experience. This is also a different style of video than my usual content, but let me know if you liked it and if you'd like to see more in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.